Thank you for your presentation of me, or for introducing me. Yeah, so this presentation is based on my article-based dissertation, which I actually submitted to pre-examination just like 10 days ago. So that's exciting. It's nearing the end. But instead of today talking about each of the articles that are part of my dissertation, I'd like to present to you the kind of general findings and then synthesize my contributions of the research overall based on the articles that are the case studies, part of this bigger project on stance taking in interest-based online communities. So in a nutshell, I'm studying stance taking as a pragmatic phenomenon in the context of interest-based online communities on social media platforms. I analyze the functions of stance in this environment, but I also compare how different communities on different platforms use stance. My approach stems from corpus pragmatics, because I want to compare several data sets in terms of the functions and the frequency of the stance functions and stance markers. So in other words, I'm looking primarily at pragmatic functions through corpus methods, such as concordance analysis. Even though the analysis of the data is complete, I am nearing the end of this PhD journey. I'd be very happy to hear your thoughts on how the theory could be developed, or future paths of research, or if you see any potential connections between what I'm doing with, what someone else is doing within linguistics or elsewhere. So that's something that, you can put in the comments, or we can discuss later. It's just as a background of what I mean by interest-based communities. I'm referring to social formations on social media platforms that are brought together because the participants want to discuss a particular topic that they are interested in. So it's kind of shared topic of conversation. This topic can range from basically be anything from politics, hobbies, entertainment, memes, you name it. But while the users have a shared interest, they don't know each other from before. And this is kind of the important part of my study, that this is not a relationship-based community like we might have on WhatsApp or Facebook or LinkedIn. These people don't know who is at the other end. They don't use their real names necessarily, and they have limited personal information about each other in terms of names, age, gender, and that kind of background information. This also means that the term community does not have its traditional meaning of like everyone knowing each other kind of sense. It's more like a matter of having a shared space and a shared interest, often a shared goal or value. But I want to do a comparative study of these communities because they differ in their characteristics. Well, when I look at these online communities, I consider both the social aspect and the technological platform aspect. So social aspects include norms, social norms, language norms, types of interaction and activities and genres, such as, are these people joking around? Are they telling personal stories? Are they, requesting and giving advice? What's going on? And social aspects also include issues like group identity and ideology. And these are in contrast to then the more technological or the technical features So a platform provides a user with features that influence the user's behavior. These are called affordances. So an affordance enables or limits behavior in certain ways. So for example, as you probably know, Twitter has a character limit. You cannot post tweets that have more than 280 characters. That's an affordance that, in a very real sense, restricts language production on Twitter. You have to be concise, or you have to split up your text into multiple tweets. As another example of a relevant affordance for my research are hashtags. So they have many functions, but a core function is that they can mark a social media post as relating to a specific topic, and they can make the post searchable and findable by other people. You can click on the hashtag, or you can type the hashtag in a search bar and get any content that relates to that topic. And in my study, I use hashtags to define kind of interest-based communities. But this just brings me to stance taking. So define briefly, stance is the expression of the writer's attitude about something, or their orientation towards something, you know, a person, a thing, an idea. The term stance taking emphasizes that stance is a dynamic act, and the expression of attitude is observable and sometimes, well, quite often, well, depends, but it's intentional, or it can be considered that they are making this stance observable rather than hiding it, and that means something. So a big motivator for people to interact with strangers in an interest-based online community is the possibility to express opinions about this discussion topic, or to share knowledge about it, to kind of show what you know or what you think. So I'm interested in how stance, as this kind of expression of personal attitude, plays a role in this context, how it's used to express attitudes and orientations. So the functions of stance that have been found in previous research on the topic. First off, stance is used to evaluate stance objects. This is quite a core function of expressing an attitude about something. I have a little text passage to exemplify these functions in action. So evaluation is often divided into evaluation related to emotions and evaluation about certainty or reliability of knowledge. This is a little passage about from a Reddit comment about social justice warriors. It's interesting content, but I just show that these words are like clearly evaluative. Unfortunately, it expresses an attitudinal evaluation that you have some kind of regret or feel a bit miffed about something. Clearly, on the other hand, is an epistemic evaluation. It emphasizes obviousness or like the certainty of knowledge, of a claim. A second function of stance is the marking of the writer's orientation. This is also connected to subjectivity, that is the writer attributing the information or the claim to themselves. So we have examples of my point is that, and I don't think, with the first person pronoun very clearly kind of connects this opinion to the writer themselves and writes in the writer into the text. There's also other pronouns in here. you and we. These are interpersonal, these have interpersonal functions in that they refer to the reader, to you who is reading this text, and also the writer and reader jointly. And these pronouns kind of maintain a dialogue and explicitly refer to the participants in this discussion, in this exchange on Reddit. So by acknowledging you, I can acknowledge your stance, maybe assume what it is, maybe disagree with it, or try to persuade you to change it. Finally, by expressing an evaluation, the writer is also saying something about themselves. So stance can be seen as a self-presentation, constructing a small context-bound projection of the writer's identity, saying, showing the writer as the kind of person who would make that kind of evaluation about that kind of thing. So by saying that something is, unfortunately, you're already showing that you are the kind of person who does not like this thing. And in this case, you are aligning yourself with groups of feminism and social justice warriors in this example. So these are the functions of stance that have been identified in previous literature and also the ones at the core of my research. But the functions of stance have been studied before, but not necessarily that much in social media texts, especially the kind of lexicogrammatical views on epistemic stance in particular that looks at like specific words. Especially that kind of approaches have focused a lot on institutional texts, such as academic or news writing, which is of course very different from social media writing, which has norms, but not the kind of very specific institutional norms. And interpersonal functions of stance have been analyzed, especially in face-to-face discussions. But again, that's again very different from social media, where you don't have the face-to-face interaction. You just have interaction with, not oral, but written interaction between people who don't know that much about each other and who can't see each other, don't have like this kind of previous knowledge, or like might not even be a true exchange, because no one can assume that you get a reply on social media. You might just be talking into the void. But not all platforms are the same, so I'm interested in whether and why platforms might differ in their use and functions of stance taking. So I'll be looking at 3 platforms: Twitter, Tumblr, and Reddit. And I'll also be comparing communities on different topics within these 3 platforms. I don't know how familiar you are with these platforms, but I'll introduce them nonetheless. Twitter, I think that you're familiar with. This is a very popular platform, which is why I chose it. It's a text-based platform, which also enables, it has multimedia, but there's a lot of text to kind of do text analysis on. Twitter is a microblog, and it has this character limit of 280 characters per post. A microblog just means that each has their own profile and that comments are kind of gathered together under your own profile. A microblog, micro refers to the shortness or the briefness of the texts. On Twitter, I see communities as being formed around hashtags that refer to a specific topic. So as in this example from hashtag climate change. anything that has been posted under hashtag climate change is contributing to this discourse around climate change, making it a post visible to other people interested in this topic. Now, Tumblr, the second platform that I study, is also a microblog like Twitter, but it's not quite as popular. It has a bit smaller user base, I should say. Now, like Twitter, it uses hashtags to define posts as related to a topic, but unlike Twitter, it does not have a character limit, so you can write quite long texts on Tumblr if you want. Interestingly, its user base is known for being kind of progressive in terms of its political views, and it's more private than Twitter, because Tumblr is not known to be used by politicians or even by big influencers using their own names. It's more pseudonymous. So more pseudonyms being used here. And this was an example of hashtag climate change on Tumblr. So like Twitter, you use a hashtag to kind of define yourself as participating in a discourse. Now for something a bit different, Reddit is not a microblog, it is a discussion forum. Typical to a discussion forum structure, it consists of subforums, which are called subreddits. Each subreddit is about a specific topic. So in this case, I have a screenshot of the climate change subreddit. There are hundreds of thousands of subreddits, but posting in one subreddit kind of defines you as participating in that discussion. And as a discussion forum, other people can then reply to that comment. So we have these entries by various people that then other people can reply to. So for example, if we have this at the top, we have a comment, we have somebody has posted manufacturing clouds. I don't know how well you can see it, but below it says it has received 6 comments, 6 replies from other users. So as part of my article-based dissertation, I'm looking at these 3 platforms. And I'm also looking at different types of communities, because online communities vary so much in what they discuss. There's so different kinds of topics. In this presentation, you'll be seeing examples from the datasets that I have used. I have looked at socio-political discussions on topics like feminism. I have looked at climate change discussions, comparing climate change, people who believe in climate change to people who are climate change skeptics. And I have also looked at a bit more trivial topics in the form of a fan community, because this is a very typical kind of online community interaction, especially on Tumblr, just fans discussing a comic book series that they like. As mentioned, I use corpus pragmatics as my method. So I decide on a set of lexicogrammatical stance features and search for them in the text data using a computer program. This is a very form to function approach, so it ignores stance that expressed in other words or in other ways than the words specified in my lexicogrammatical features list. If something's specified in some a bit more implicit ways, that's not going to be found through corpus pragmatics, unfortunately. But corpus pragmatics is scalable. it's because it's computer assisted, it can be applied to a big data set. In the case studies that are part of my dissertation, I have corpora, and with each corpus having like between 100,000 or 300 words per community studied. So this enables to finding lots of instances of this kind of stance that I study, and also enables some statistical tests to see whether frequency difference is significant or not. The lists of lexicogrammatical forms are based on previous research and on the most frequent stance expression in the data. So when I make these word lists, I then identify all those features in my text data and extract them to a concordance list. And this picture shows just a sample concordance of words used to express epistemic stance, so the evaluation of probability or of factuality. For each concordance line, I can manually or semi-manually annotate the concordance for the function based on the semantic meaning or the code text. So you can see that it has the words that come before the search word and a bit of the code text what comes after the search word. I can, by manually looking at each line, I can also remove any false positives, so any instances that might not actually have a stance function. But based on this data, I count how many stance forms and functions occur in each of the studied communities. And that way I can compare the communities in terms of the frequency of stance and the frequency of specific stance functions. But of course, beyond just looking at frequency numbers, it's important to contextualize and explain the frequencies also on the context variables, such as the social norms or the user base or the platform. So moving on to my findings based on my research so far, I'll just start by discussing the interpersonal functions of stance. So the way that stance marks the writer's subjective perspective to text and the audience and to writer-reader relations. Based on previous research about subjectivity, and intersubjectivity and metadiscourse theory, I selected lexicogrammatical forms associated with interpersonal functions. So first off, many words used for evaluating epistemicity are used for hedging, so for softening a claim. Words like maybe, possibly, unsure, they are kind of soften the commitment so you don't come off as strong. In this little example, you can see some instances of softened commitment. Hedging is generally used as part of face work for not imposing on the reader in order to avoid conflict or disagreement. Secondly, references to the reader with the pronoun you or with the reader inclusive we acknowledge the presence of the reader in the exchange. So we suggests that I and you are united in the same referent group. As in this example, we all know. When stance is attributed to we jointly, this assumes that the perspective is shared by the writer and the reader, that we're in this together. So in this instance, there's the epistemic stance attributed to we, that assuming that both you and I know this thing is a fact. Finally, drawing on meta-discourse theory, awareness of the reader can also be expressed through references to the discourse, through so-called meta-discourse or meta-language, language used to refer to language itself. So references to the exchange that's currently ongoing. So as in this example, we have this comment chain and the discussion, which refer to the texts of the previous participants. And the previous participants themselves are being addressed as you. So this kind of awareness of the text and how the text or how the exchange, the discourse is organized. References also to the kind of the affordances of the platform with this comment chain, referring to a Reddit discussion. So these are linguistically explicit acknowledgement of intertextuality and interaction in a shared discursive space. So across the case studies of my dissertation, I compared lexicogrammatical forms like this on my 3 study platforms. And the interesting empirical bit is that throughout my case studies, I found that there are frequency differences between the platforms. Specifically, the interpersonal stance features are consistently more frequent on Reddit than on Twitter. So in this figure, you can see that Reddit, marked in red, has a higher number of epistemic stance functioning as hedging, so functioning for softening the claim in order to avoid disagreement. Reddit also contains more pronouns addressing the reader, or meta-language used to refer to elements of the discourse and the discussion. So these are much more frequent on Reddit than on Twitter in light blue, or Tumblr in dark blue. So in my 2022 paper that was in Register Studies, the journal, I compare Reddit and Twitter posts on climate change and climate change skepticism. And Reddit is much more focused on comparing and contrasting opinions with participants, whereas Twitter is much more focused on making claims and statements as information, like providing you the facts or saying that this is like so, this is a fact, rather than kind of comparing and each user kind of piping in with their contribution. So my hypothesis is that Reddit has more interpersonal stance because Reddit is more dialogic. There's an exchange because it's a discussion forum. So hashtag Twitter and Tumblr posts might not have such a back and forth discussion going on, or it's not at least assumed. So this idea stems from the assumption that in Register, that language varieties differ based on the mode and the genre and the communicative purpose of a text or the communication context. This is a social linguistic or register analytical perspective and explanation. Another explanation could be that Twitter, which has shorter texts, would be more concise, and that's why it wouldn't have, it wouldn't waste time on or space on hedging and pronouns. But this doesn't really seem to be the case because Tumblr doesn't have like a character limit, and Tumblr also has a lower frequency of this kind of interpersonal stance features. So the idea would be that Reddit is more dialogical, at least in terms of socio-political and climate-related discussions, which is what these studies were based on. There's a bit of a problem with this comparison, that we are risking comparing apples to oranges. So I studied Twitter posts with a hashtag, and these are more commonly initiating a discussion rather than replying to a previous tweet. They could be replies, but often they're not. And it has been noted that interpersonal stance is a bit less common in initiating tweets rather than in reply tweets. So reply tweets would maybe have more of stance, but they are less often hashtagged, so there might be less of them in my data. Nevertheless, the idea is that hashtags and platforms, hashtags and subreddits are how the platforms allow you to share your thoughts with the target audience interested in a particular topic. So that's how you share ideas with the interest-based community. So, and many of the tweets and Tumblr posts still make references to the audience or to the discourse of the hashtag. So in part, it can also be about social norms, with Twitter users just being less concerned with these politeness functions of stance, or Twitter being used more for this kind of very focused information rather than comparing opinions. But of course, you shouldn't be too deterministic with the technical features of a social media platform. And I also looked at different topic discussions in the same platform, so different communities, to confirm that the platform is not the only variable. For example, climate change skeptics and climate change people who believe in climate change proponents communicate in quite different ways, with skeptics having a bit more this kind of dialogue with their opponents, whereas people who believe in climate change are a bit more information focused. So moving on to the evaluative stance, because stance is specifically the writer's attitude, I focused on expressions where stance is explicitly subjective, so explicitly attributed to the writer. An obvious form of explicitly subjective evaluation is coupling a first-person pronoun with a mental or cognitive verb. So like, I know, I think, I believe. But also affective mental verbs, I love, I like, I dislike, or I don't like. So these are the kind of expressions I looked at, such as I love to express affective stance, and I know to mark epistemic stance. And also, we saw a couple examples, we know to indicate that the epistemic stance is like shared by a larger group. A couple of examples of this kind of evaluation is just I love, or I really like it. Of course, subjectivity can also be a bit more implicit, or you might not mention that this is specifically my idea. So my study did include a case study with implicitly subjective epistemicity. So adverb constructions such as clearly, clearly, maybe, probably, but also just nouns and verbs such as lie or truth, misinterpretation, that kind of carry a strong evaluation of a truthfulness of something. The social aspects and how stance as the writer's attitude is related to interaction in the community. Drawing on previous research on stance in interaction, the writers and the reader, or the speaker and the hearer, but in this case, the writer and the reader are both oriented towards the same object, which is being evaluated. So this is a model of by Du Bois, where me, the writer, and then the reader, the audience are both directed towards a shared stance object. Du Bois' model is kind of based on a dyadic exchange with only two people, one speaker, one hearer, but I would like to expand on it to acknowledge that the reader is not a single reader, it's an audience, because as I mentioned at the beginning, interest-based online communities have no face-to-face communication or previously established relationships. They have very little information about each other, and they're not necessarily in response to anyone specific. There's more like an ambient target audience going on rather than a specific person. So when I evaluate something, that can be seen as me evaluating something in order to position myself with the broader community, or to align myself with the overall community that I am myself participating in, that I may be a member of, or at least want to be a member of. As mentioned before, stance is performative, so a form of self-presentation. It says something about who you are. So evaluation can be seen as a positioning the user in relationship to the audience in general. So just as a few examples from the data, how writers are taking part in community discourse, how they are aligning themselves with an audience. In a fan community around a comic book series contained affective stance evaluating mainly the characters of the story of the comic, because this is what matters to these particular discussants more than, for example, the writer or the producers of the comic or its franchise. So they are interested in the characters, they're interested in fan practices like fan fiction. So by evaluating these things, they are aligning themselves with the target audience. Especially positive evaluation using love was very frequent, especially on Tumblr and Twitter. But this kind of frequency of I love, you can't really explain that with the technological factor, such as dialogicity. Rather, the differences in frequency of evaluative stance is about what the users talk about, what kind of attitudes they want to express on a particular platform. Why is it important for them to say that they love this particular character? So Tumblr and Twitter in particular are about expressing enthusiasm. Reddit seemed a bit more about comparing opinions again and reactions to the latest plot developments, for example. So the frequency of affective stance is associated with the user bases and what these users what activities they associate the platforms with, what are the platforms used for. As another example, in my case study on the discussions about climate change, the general topic is climate science, climate policies, and environmentally friendly lifestyle. I analyzed the stance objects and functions of epistemic stance. I expected climate change discussions to contain evaluations about the factuality of climate science. But from a discourse analytical perspective, climate change skeptics talk about the veracity, or more like the falsity, of climate science to a much greater extent than people who do believe in climate science, who do believe in climate change. So people who believe in climate change instead talk about the likelihood of climate scenarios, the likelihood that the seas will rise or of hurricanes, not so much of the factuality behind these events or the reliability of the climate scientists who are spreading this information. So skeptics are much more concerned with truthfulness. And again, this has to do with what the communities are about. What do they care about? People who believe in climate science know that they are the majority consensus, so they don't debate it. The frequency of a lot of epistemic stance discussing the veracity or factuality of climate science, that's associated with kind of debating whether climate science is real. So it's associated more with skeptics. So essentially, by taking a stance, the writer is taking part in the community discourse and is positioning themselves as taking part in the community discourse. After all, the writers are evaluating things that matter to the community according to the values resonating with the community. But when you look at this kind of evaluations in topics on worldviews and ideologies, the triangle model between just me and my audience is a bit misleading, because by taking a stance, a user is not just evaluating a stance object that matters to the community, they're also positioning themselves as part of the community. This is especially apparent in the use of the pronoun we to refer to both the writer's self and their audience. The writer kind of becomes a spokesperson of the we community. If you look at this from a discourse analytical perspective, this is probably quite obvious. The very starting point of your research is that, studying what themes are being discussed. But for researchers from a narrower pragmatics direction that doesn't look at context so much, this perspective of shared discourse is an important reminder about the importance of context and co-text. And for those doing quantitative computer-assisted analysis, anything like purely quantitative corpus or computational linguistics with sentiment analysis or other things, it's a reminder to look at what is being evaluated, and is this target of evaluation important to the community, or what role does it play? It's not just that climate change skeptics evaluate reliability more frequently, it's that the reliability of climate scientists and decision makers is an interesting topic for the user base represented by the data. So the discourse act of evaluating, of taking a stance, is central to the interest of the interest-based community. So just in summary, there are differences between platforms in the frequency and in the functions of stance. The discussion forum Reddit has different uses than the microblogs, Twitter and Tumblr, because the platforms and the communities are structured in different ways. And there's also differences in what goals the platforms are used for, you know, discussions or maybe informing an audience. I would like to see more comparison of platforms, because this would further develop our understanding of what stance is used for in different digital registers and genres. More broadly, it would associate stance and other pragmatic functions as well with different kinds of communicative affordances and discourse situations. So more research on monologic and dialogic online texts, if we can keep up with the kind of new platforms that are constantly emerging. But just it works in different ways than face-to-face spoken interaction or institutional writing. So recontextualization of these functions is needed. And just in terms of the methods, I think that corpus pragmatics or corpus-based discourse analysis is a good way to kind of balance between quantitative and qualitative views. Depending on the phenomenon you study, it's possible to at least as a good starting point. But of course, a limitation of this study is that you might not find all instances of the phenomenon you study if it's not easily limited to a word list or a list of phrases. And another thing is that you might already have some questions about what about individual users? Does a single person behave differently on Reddit than they do on Twitter? And that's something that would really require an ethnographic view, or something that, or a whole ethical and legal structure of being able to track a single user's behavior. And that's not something that's very feasible for a corpus compiler, unfortunately. But maybe with something like, if there's metadata about social connections, that could maybe be used. But yeah, another thing is, of course, that the corpus linguistics for multimodal data is still at the very beginning, and there's not that many tools available yet, but that would certainly be something interesting to look into in the future. But I would just now like to open the floor for discussion. So about pragmatics stance, or more broadly about discourse and text. As I'm at the end of my PhD, I'm kind of thinking about the significance of my research a lot lately. So if you have any comments or recommendations about where to go from here, or applications, it would be nice if you can share those. Thank you for your attention. I have a list of references, quite a few, but maybe if you want a specific reference, you can always email me, and I can share the slides with you or point you to a specific reference if you want. But that's it for me. Thank you.